Has been so deeply influential among people who are otherwise contributing their own thoughts and ideas. So in a sense, his influence has been in the area of determining the thoughts of people who generally are in the thought leadership space. So people who are writers, journalists, or intellectuals. I think that is where he has had maximum impact. I mean, so in a sense, the kind of impact he has had is difficult to calculate because there is the spread effect. So when we talk about Rajiv Malhotra's ideas to other people, then it get cascaded to hundreds and thousands of people again. So I think, I mean, the word intellectual Kshatriya, which he invented, is probably very vital because that helps you decide the contours of what kind of ideological stance makes sense from an Indic and a dharmic perspective. So he opened our eyes to that, and he's helped us with the kind of intellectual tools that help you talk to many people who think, oh, what's the problem? We have survived 5,000 years, we'll survive the next 5,000. This is a kind of foolish argument you get, not knowing that a leaf in a pond which doubles every day is only half full one day before it's fully covered. So you don't know when the inflection point is where you can lose the argument and a lot of civilizational heritage there. So I think he's, for the last 25 years, he's been doing this, and it's commendable, incredible job, and it's been of huge support for us people who try to cascade these ideas to a slightly different audience. I think the problem is one of the Indian character. We tend to argue a little too much and listen far less. I think we would benefit more if we listen to people who have something useful to say, like Rajiv ji. So my thing is, I think we have this word called ahankar. That is, we have too much of self ego, and that sort of interferes with our ability to understand and build something together. So we tend to have too many of those ego tussles. I think if we are able to lower this at certain levels, it will make a huge difference. So, for example, Rajiv ji has been talking to all kinds of people. He's been talking to people from the Sangh Parivar, from, say, people, Gurujis, like Sadhguru or Sri Ravi Shankar, who have a large following. But he pointed out in one of his conversations with me, he's not talking about anybody specific like that. He said the problem is when you have such a huge following, if you do not think of succession, then you are automatically your limit falls the minute you are not in the scene. So I think Indians need to think of the very long term beyond your own life's thing. That is one thing that Rajiv ji has himself done. The fact that he's produced 8 or 10 books in the last 5 years shows that he wants his thoughts to remain far beyond his own lifetime. So that is the way Indians need to think, and not think that everything must be achieved when I am around. It may not be. I mean, this is a generational work, multi-generational work, and everybody has to play a role, not just intellectuals. Even the people who have large followings need to build for the long term. So he's been talking to a lot of that, and if we are able to just imbibe that aspect and think not just of my lifetime and what I can do, but how can the legacy continue. I mean, after all, we didn't survive 5,000 years by people thinking only about their own lifetimes, right? I mean, so they left behind something that others could carry forward. So that is where we need to do. And he's been trying to impress that on a lot of people he meets. And I think if all of us think beyond our own lifetimes and our own ego satisfaction in doing something right, I think we'll probably achieve much more. Basically, he's giving us all the intellectual tools for to carry the work forward. Apart from doing his own direct work with various groups and other things, I mean, he's been talking to various people in various organizations and hope that some of what he suggests is carried forward there. I think that is where I think he's doing the maximum. And the fact that he's encouraging a lot of new writers, where many of his books are jointly authored by others, which means that these people can continue the work long after Rajiv is not there. I mean, of course, it doesn't sound nice to say that, but we know nobody is going to live forever, and neither you nor me nor Rajiv ji. And the fact that he's thinking beyond that is one of his greatest contributions. I think he is encouraging a second and third generation of people to do that. And today, the fact that many people who may have benefited from his thoughts, who today have successful YouTube channels, they may not all agree with him, but the fact is they got motivated by the thought that you have to do a lot of this intellectual, analysis, studies, deep study. So many people are doing that, and people have started generating a lot of good books. I think it'll take another generation before this fully seeps through. But the task of the first generation and creating the next round of people is probably very well underway, and Rajivji may have a huge contribution in that. I was very involved with him when he launched his more recent book, Snakes in the Ganga, which has had a terrific impact both here and also in academics in the US, which is where we also need to target, because whole of Indology seems to have been exported to the US. And the only guy fighting against that trend is somebody like Rajiv Malhotra or a few others, or S.N. Bal Gangadhara and people like that. So I think that his probably his second book, Invading the Sacred, was my initial drawing into that. But I think Being Different was a fantastic book, that made me think a lot about how these important cultural differences shape thinking in the West and in India, and the limitations of their process and the strengths of ours, and of course the limitations of ours and the strengths of theirs. So it was something there. And I think I have, of course, read every single one of his books, but I think Snakes in the Ganga was another transformative kind of book, because it brought together all the current trends in the US intellectual discourse, which was doing huge damage to their own society and spreading the damage elsewhere. I think the arrival of Trump is partly, at least, a corrective for that, though Trump may be a nasty character. But the fact is that he is challenged some of those intellectual assumptions, and to that extent, it makes a difference. And I think in India, unfortunately, we are we're still not emerged from that. One is the colonial mindset, where we still think that we need a pat on the back from the white man. That's one that remains a problem with a lot of Indians. Secondly, I think either we become too defensive about ourselves, or we become too offensive about ourselves. You need to have the right thought process. You can see when Rajiv argues, somebody disagrees. He doesn't try and alienate the guy. He just says that, look, this is where I agree, this is where I don't. So it becomes a conversation rather than something where you have to prove that you're greater than the other fellow. It's not like that. So I think that's where I think a lot of changes are happening. And I'm glad that this process has begun. He's done it for a quarter century now. And we hope that he's there for another quarter century to continue the process. I think if the government had been more receptive to many of his things, it would have made a huge difference to the scale at which he could have had an impact in India. The government should have actually seen that, but the government, I don't know, has been very narrow focused. And it's not been, they're focused on some right things, but I would say that they have not really utilized a person of Rajit's caliber to the extent they could have. And that's my regret. Yeah, Rajiv, you are in many ways my intellectual hero, because I think a lot of my own thoughts got clarified by reading your books, associating personally with you on some of the events and discussions we have had, and also the personal trip that we had all through Chicago, where we went and visited some museum and some place here and there. That was actually very useful, because he had no airs about himself that, oh, I'm a great guy, why should I be moving around with you to a hotel or for a museum? So we went together. That was a very pleasant memory for me, because it's like a personal association with somebody who you admire and who you also value as a colleague and a fellow thinker.